I am Enrico Baccarin, and I am a cultural anthropologist, and I've been studying the Far East, and especially India, for more than 20 years, and I am fascinated by it. And this is because, during my many years of university research, I asked myself questions, and I couldn't find answers. So I tried to investigate personally, delving into not only specific texts, but also trying to go to places, to study firsthand, seeing, interviewing, and therefore understanding things with my own eyes. And I think that this is an approach that can obviously help to examine the historical mysteries, the situations of humanity's past that we still do not know or understand. And this is especially for distant territories, for very distant and even very large territories, such as India or other countries of the Far East. And regarding the Far East, and in particular India, very few people, or just a few experts, know that, as in the West we know of the myth of Atlantis through Plato, and therefore Solon, who had heard it from the Egyptians, there are very similar stories, or stories that are almost identical, in the Far East territories and India. It is curious that in the Indian world, which is a subcontinent and therefore has an immeasurable territorial extension, huge if compared to Western areas, we find archaeological evidence, traces of something that doesn't add up, something that existed before what official history told us or led us to believe, and these traces are still there. I am referring in particular to a lot of underground cities, submerged cities, which in some cases have been almost accidentally rediscovered along the entire Indian perimeter. Taking a small step back to a historical fact which is almost unknown, as there were the Sumerians and the Egyptians in the West, in territories closer to us, the Indian world hosted a little-known civilization, especially in northern India, which is now Pakistan, which, after about 4,000 years of silence, around the middle of the 1800s, was rediscovered almost totally by chance. While the English were at work building railways and various infrastructures, they found themselves in front of a lot of bricks and also structures, obviously buried by time and history, that told of something different, that in that territory, which is now Pakistan in northern India, existed an immense, very advanced civilization, called by some the Valinda civilization, and by others the Harappan civilization, from the name of Harappa, which was the first city to be discovered in the mid-19th century. Up until now, at least 1,056 archaeological sites have been found, and it is estimated that the Harappan's population had reached levels of 5 million inhabitants, considering that in Mesopotamia with the Sumerians they reached 300 to 400,000. And it's a civilization that was born already advanced and already developed, because to date history has not given us elements to say that there had been a progression, as can be imagined and has always happened, that from small huts, or in any case very simple structures, they have arrived to building large cities. There are large urban agglomerations, Mohenjo-daro that was rediscovered in the 1920s and had up to 100,000 inhabitants, therefore a megalopolis in antiquity. And we know from Sumerian stelae that the Valinda traded with them, objects such as lapis lazuli, gold, copper, but also animals such as peacocks and elephants, which obviously did not exist in Mesopotamia. And it's a civilization that is almost not even studied in school books, only those who are interested in certain areas know. However, it is a truly fascinating civilization because it is correlated to the Sumerians, perhaps even more ancient. If we go to what is the border towards Afghanistan, in Baluchistan, there are settlements of a Proto-Valinda civilization, which is dated back to at least 8500 BC. Therefore, this is an era close to Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, which is considered the first temple of humanity, and which was buried in 9500–9600 BC, therefore testifying that it had been used a long time before that date, as other studies and research has proven. And this changes our consideration of human history. It changes our relationship with the past, because if we have always been used to reading or thinking that more or less the Egyptians and Sumerians were the first to have invented, created, structured and written language, and also the first forms of useful tools and technologies, we realize that if we go to the east, in India, there is something older that appears as if from nowhere. This is a dilemma that still puzzles scholars today, as we are unable to decipher the writing of this Valinda civilization. That little we do know, we can gather from the sacred Indian texts. Obviously, some of this knowledge converged within what later became Hinduism, which was born in times much closer to us. And there are traces of a history that has been forgotten for a very long time, perhaps millennia. We are unable to translate their writing, but however, in Mohenjo-daro, for example, very small steatite seals were found, which can still be seen today at the National Museum in New Delhi, where, for example, there is a proto-Shiva, a Rudra, so the ancient name with which Shiva was called, which is in a very particular yoga position called Mula Bandha. This is a seal that dates back to at least 3500 BC, if not a little earlier, and it is a bewildering fact because it proves what the tradition of yoga claims to be, dating back at least 5,000 if not 6,000 years. Rudra is a very particular figure because there are many traditions that concern it. For example, those present in the Shiva Purana, which is one of the sacred texts of Shaivism, which narrate that Shiva was the first yoga master, also known as Adi Yogi, and taught this practice according to some traditions to Matsya, who was a small fish, who transformed into a human being. According to other traditions, he taught it to the 7 wise men, who are emblematic figures, the custodians of Indian wisdom, who would then take it to the various Indian territories. Shiva is a particular figure because it is part of the Indian Trimurti. The Trimurti is a little bit similar, if a comparison can be made, to the Trinity in the Western world. The Indian Trimurti sees Shiva, Brahma and Vishnu as the 3 faces of the same body, which are considered as the creator, the destroyer and the one who regenerates the world, but in fact they are a single entity. There are many traditions about the place where Shiva lived. Among the many places there is Varanasi, but the main place is Mount Kailash in Tibet, which is a mountain that has not yet been climbed, because it is a sacred mountain for many religions. And we find the figure of Shiva together with other divinities, but in particular Shiva in many traditions and in many Indian contexts, in which he is represented as not so much a divine being, because he could die too. He was considered essentially as a concrete figure made of flesh and bones, as a being who manifested himself on this planet in the moments when there was the greatest need, to teach yoga, to teach certain spiritual paths, to teach religion and wisdom. And among other things, it is curious, for example, how often his departure, presumed as his return to the higher planes, we do not know well which ones, was accompanied by what is called the Jyotirlinga, that is, a column of light or fire according to other traditions, which surrounded him and brought him back to the astral or celestial planes, where his most appropriate home was. The entire Indian world, therefore, has a mixture of traditions and legends concerning what may have been a civilization prior to ours, a sort of Indian Atlantis, destroyed by what was the Great Flood that is common to many traditions. In the Indian world, it is called Pralaya, and then we will make a distinction because the south of India has a somewhat different tradition. But this Great Flood is, in reality, as science claims today, the end of the last ice age. Large masses of ice were found throughout northern Europe, and not only, and they melt and also flow into the seas, and this obviously generates a disaster on a global level. This change in India brought the rise of the sea levels up to 140 meters, so it has been estimated there were tens, if not in some cases hundreds of kilometers of coastline that were totally submerged by this rise due to the end of the last ice age. And the interesting thing, which is all linked to the whole Indian culture, to its traditions, is that more or less since the beginning of 2000, since 2004, a series of tsunamis occurred, both in the north and in the south of India. As we know, a tsunami is anticipated by the sea receding. Then it's more or less a high wave that destroys everything it hits. In the Indian case, in various areas, more or less along the entire coastal perimeter, from the Gulf of Cambay to Goa and to Mahabalipuram and Pumpar, which are in the south, when the sea receded, in the sandy seabed of those areas, it could be seen that there were some structures that were connected to ancient myths, to ancient traditions of previous kingdoms or civilizations that had existed in those very places. A particular place in the northwest of India is the city of Dwarka, the sacred city of Krishna. It was the city that Krishna had rebuilt several times, and the incredible thing is that the official bodies of the Indian government, such as the NIOT, which is the Marine Agency for Underwater Research, or the National Archaeological Institute, have seen how, for example, the city of Dwarka had been rebuilt at least 7 times because of the advance of the sea. And so, going offshore, of course, marine archaeology is still little used in the West, and it is even less so in these territories. It has been seen by making expeditions from the year 2000 to the present day, as well as along the entire submerged coastal perimeter of Dwarka, and in other areas there were remains, artificial remains, therefore submerged structures created by man in obviously more ancient times that went to corroborate what was the tradition, the myth, the legends that in the Indian world then obviously merge into sacred texts and religious traditions. Among other things, it must be said that Dwarka is a particular city, apart from for those who are devoted to the god Krishna, but mainly because there are traditions that mention how Krishna had fought on board his Vimana, therefore an aircraft, one of the aircrafts of the gods, of the various aircrafts that they had, against another deity, who was Salva, and this battle had taken place right above the skies of Dwarka and in its proximity, and the events that took place are the destruction of the Vimana aircraft of the god Salva and the victory of Krishna. So it is a legend that is similar to the reality of the facts, because in that specific case it was seen that the historical period in which the god Krishna would have lived and died, according to the Mahabharata, in 3102 BC, at that historic moment there was actually a city, unknown until 2000, but it had been submerged by the waters, and numerous scientific publications have been made on this. Some ruins have also been found, obviously worn down and corroded by the waters, but they tell us how this area was once standing in the light of the sun. This area had hosted a piece of the city that had then been submerged. If we move to the south of India, we find similar traditions, but some that are also different. The area of South India, besides the fact that the Indian population of these geographical areas is a little different with a slightly darker complexion, it has particular and different traditions from those of the north. In the south of India, for example, there are two very fascinating traditions that tell of a territory that existed in ancient times, and it was a civilization, a sort of Atlantis of the Indian Sea, which, because of cataclysms and the rise of the seas, would have sunk, and there is talk of a huge island that they call Kumari Kandam, and this is the Indian Atlantis. There are also Indian texts where they speak about Atala, the White Island, placed in the west, where theoretically Plato places our Atlantis, the one we have learned about and read about. And therefore, here we ask ourselves how it is possible that a purely Western myth arrived or managed to reach this land in ancient times. However, Kumari Kandam was this huge territory that, according to tradition, according to the various texts of South India, was one of the places where the gods, at the beginning, when they began to arrive here to manifest themselves among men, they first went to this territory, and then, from there, started slowly going to the India we know today. Kumari Kandam would have suffered various cataclysms, various catastrophic events in very ancient times. There are those who estimate even 300,000 years ago, but obviously they are such remote eras that you can only mention them without commenting on them, until more recent times, and then this territory would have sunk. And it is interesting that, over the last 10 years, a series of research and analyses have been made, and they have proven that a territory under Sri Lanka was once not covered by water. So there was a fairly large area of land that could have hosted even more cities, which was then submerged by the water. When the Kumari Kandam sinks definitively, what happens? The traditions of the south of India tell us that in 3 different historical periods, the Sangams were created. The Sangam is the name we could give to our universities of today. So they were places that sunk at least 10,000 years ago, but that in different historical periods have hosted great sages, who are then the great sages of ancient India, who a little later also passed into legend, whose purpose was not only to preserve knowledge, but also to carry it forward, so to try to create progress for that which was the humanity of that historical moment. And in all this context, of course, those who are the various divinities are cited on several occasions, including Shiva himself, and others who would have interacted with these sages in antiquity, donating sparingly a little of what was their own knowledge, which the Indian texts tell us is always given by these beings, by these devas, for the benefit of humanity, therefore not to create death or destruction, but to try to promote the improvement, the progress of the individual as well as of the communities. And various figures, first and foremost Shiva, but not only, have manifested themselves within this historical period of these Sangams, bringing what were their contributions and trying for the human tradition, for the Indian tradition, to help and improve the lives of these people in these areas. Another very interesting element is that in India there are many traditions. So often North India has different traditions from South India. In North India, for example, the the story that then becomes the epic book of the Ramayana, so the story of Rama and all the events that concern him to save his wife Sita, who had been kidnapped by an Asura, by a demon named Ravana. This story places the city of Lanka, the city where Sita was held prisoner, in the city of Mohenjo-daro, which was a Valindan city, located in what is now Pakistan. For a series of reasons, in the 70s, a large group of university professors had placed the mythical city of the epic poem not in Sri Lanka, but in Mohenjo-daro. This was due to a whole series of reasons. First of all, Sri Lanka is a modern name that it was given in the 70s. Before, it was called Ceylon, Serendip, and then also, especially in the descriptions of the territories, the plants, the mountains that are in Sri Lanka do not correlate to what is in the Ramayana, while they correlate to what was and still is, in part today, the area near Mohenjo-daro. Mohenjo-daro, in addition, is located very close to the Indus River. I'm talking about 300 to 400 meters away, which is a huge river. In ancient times, it was even bigger, and we know that this city already could contain up to 100,000 inhabitants. It was a commercial city, so trade took place along the Indus River, but several times a year the river flooded its banks, and the city, not the city as such, but the nearby area was flooded, turning Mohenjo-daro into a real island, Lanka in Sanskrit. For this reason, and for various other elements, scholars believe that those events, the events of the Ramayana, were not located in southern India, in Sri Lanka, but in present-day Pakistan. Besides this, there is a whole series of elements that in the past years, I would say in the past decades, have come out. That is, the war fought in the Ramayana brings into question the Vimanas, so these aircraft used by Rama, by Ravana, who had his Pushpaka Vimana, and the use of a whole series of destructive weapons that annihilate a large part of their respective armies. One could say that the vulgar myth, the tradition that has more or less begun to be affirmed since the 1970s, is that the descriptions of the Ramayana make one think that an atomic bomb had been used in the area of Mohenjo-daro, so this area had been the theatre of an anti-litteram atomic war. This can make you smile. However, if one reads the Ramayana, the effects that certain weapons used by Rama, the effects that are described in the text, seem to remind us of a nuclear explosion. But we can say that up until a few years ago, there had never actually been any field research. Personally, I was lucky enough to go to Mohenjo-daro in Pakistan in 2012. I was lucky enough to take samples from various areas of the site and to visit it in its entirety, and also to take some instruments with me, such as Geiger counters and others, to analyse the terrain, the objects, rocks, and so on. What resulted is very interesting data, but what came out after that was also very interesting data. So, if it's true that the Ramayana seems to describe a certain type of weapons, it is also true that it is specified that those weapons were Tejas Astra, that is, literally energy weapons in Sanskrit, which, in the sense of reading it without interpreting what the Ramayana says, are weapons that had created a great heat, destroying the southern area of the Lanka, as described in the epic poem, and thus making Rama win the battle. If we go to Mohenjo-daro, what do we find there? Well, the little that has been, let's say, excavated and brought to light is a very complex city with street lighting in 2000 BC, houses with 2 or 3 floors, running water, 400 wells to extract water. But if you move to the south of the city, as the Ramayana tells us, you will find a plateau, an expanse of sand and soil, spotted with black pebbles. When I went there in 2012, I asked what they were, and the archaeologists did not know how to give an explanation. The most common answer that was given was that they were waste from furnaces, but seeing these fragments, these objects that are molten and vitrified in some cases, and comparing them to the scraps of furnace waste, you immediately see that they are different, and several analyses that I performed later confirmed this. The whole southern area of the city is totally covered with, especially for a diameter of about 500 meters, thousands of these black objects. I would say, looking at them carefully, they are nothing other than pieces of bricks, pieces of bracelets, pieces of even bowls and so on, that have been exposed to a very strong source of heat. The southern area does not have a crater. It doesn't have a pit due to an explosion that normally occurs when something explodes on the ground. But if we look in the Ramayana, we are told the story of Rama, who uses these Tejas Astra, these weapons, making them explode at high altitude near the Pushpaka Vimana, which was the other Vimana of the demon Ravana. I took these samples and brought back the instruments, which had not given background radioactivity other than the environmental radioactivity common in any place where we are. And the most frequently asked question is, but if these events occurred at least 4,000 years ago, if not earlier, how would it be possible to find radioactivity? Well, the decay period of fissile materials, which are those of a hypothetical atomic explosion, is of the order of at least 10 to 20,000 years. So we should have found either traces of radioactivity, or at least in the land where the radioactive material would have decayed over thousands of years. But there is none of this. The level of radioactivity, as I said, was totally normal. I brought back to Italy some samples, and I had these samples analysed. I had them analysed in 4 laboratories, including one in the United States, and what came out independently was the same result, which, at least as far as I'm concerned, is truly emblematic and fascinating. All the results say just one thing, that is, that those objects that I had recovered and that were scattered over the southern area of the city were the result of an explosion or an event X, as it's defined in the analysis, that gave off heat between 1500 and 2000 degrees for a period not exceeding 4 seconds. Which corresponds, at least using logic, to what is an explosive phenomenon, something that explodes at altitude and generates a bubble of heat that burns. And let's consider that these objects were baked clay, first kneaded clay, then baked in the kilns, and then subjected again to this new heat event that makes them melt and become a shapeless mass. The analysis told us this: a very high temperature for a very short period. In some cases the samples were vitrified, so with a greenish colour, and the temperature reached was about 900 degrees. But the even more interesting thing is that these analyses also tell us how these objects that I had recovered had been subjected twice to a heat source, which means precisely that the first time the clay was taken, it was kneaded, the vase was created and then put in an oven to bake it. The second time is this event X that liquefied it again to what was its original state. There is no trace of radioactivity, there's no trace of rare elements, there's no trace of anything that indicates an atomic explosion, which was for many years, I would say 40 years if not 50, let's say the main leading theory used by some scholars to say that anomalous events had occurred in that area. The fact that radioactivity was not found does not, however, change the factors, because in any case, that type of event cannot be explained by anything in a historical period that should be at least between 2000 and 2500 BC. It is not a tectonic zone, it's not a volcanic area, there are no meteor impacts, we would have found iridium, there is no crater, so whatever generated that heat generated it at a certain height, and therefore did not create an impact, a crater created by an explosion on the ground. But, as happened for example in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, bombs were blown up at a height of 500 to 600 meters. There is no crater on the two cities, but there is destruction precisely because, by exploding it at a high altitude, the wave of destruction is even more powerful. So it is, let's say, in the military logic of those who can use a certain type of weapon to make it explode at high altitude. Everything tells us that Mohenjo-daro could effectively be the Lanka described in the Ramayana, and what is described as an air battle on board Vimanas in the Ramayana perhaps also finds actual confirmations with that which are the traces that can still be found there. And it must be said that it's a city that was rediscovered during the years 1920-1922, 2 years in which a part of the city was excavated, and up until today it has not undergone major excavation, precisely because it's located in a country, in a territory where it is not so easy to dig and have funding to excavate. Less than 15% of the entire surface of the archaeological site has been excavated. But the southern area matches totally with what the Ramayana tells us and the Indian legends tell us. I'm a bit sorry to dispel the myth of the atomic explosion, but I too started with that belief, however absurd it may be, placing it 4,000 years ago. But what came out by performing some analysis is that actually these objects were subjected to something that is not natural, that cannot be the result of melted waste from a furnace, but can only be due to something technological that at least 4,000 years ago exploded in the southern part of the city and literally destroyed a part of it. I also want to say that there is another interesting fact. Earlier we spoke about how Mohenjo-daro had a population of about 100,000 inhabitants, and this was estimated from the number of houses and from a simple statistical report, assuming that in each house there were at least 3 or 4 people as a family unit, if not more. But the interesting thing is that of these 100,000 people, only 43 skeletons have been found. And the curious thing is that in the Ramayana, where this war is talked about that will come to the city of Lanka, the inhabitants of Lanka are told to leave, because in a week ashes and fire will rain down from the sky, more or less the same as what happened to Sodom and Gomorrah in the Old Testament. And nobody knows what happened to the population of Mohenjo-daro. Only 43 skeletons are found. Of these 43 skeletons, 10 are calcined. And what does this mean? And these are the ones closest to the southern part of the city. It means that these people, when they were still alive, were subjected to a very strong source of heat that led the mineral parts of their bones to evaporate, so as if they had been vaporized themselves. These skeletons were found and mentioned already in the first reports of the archaeologists of the 30s and 40s, Mortimer Wheeler and others. We are talking about calcination, and we can immediately exclude that it is not cremation. We must simply say that we do not know or understand what happened to these people. So, a further element that clearly tells us how something unnatural, anomalous, absurd happened in the southern part of this city, and this totally coincides with the battle between the two Vimanas of Rama and Ravana that is narrated in the epic poem of the Ramayana. So another very interesting myth that we find in the Indian world is that of the 7 wise men, or Saptarishi. These 7 wise men are basically the civilizers of the Indian people. Tradition states that Manu, the Indian Noah, following the coming of the Great Flood, when he saved the seeds of plants, animals, men and women, his main purpose, however, was to save knowledge, which in Sanskrit is called Veda, like their sacred text. And in order to save knowledge, he took the Saptarishi, the 7 wise men, and made them board his boat. Then, after all the events, a very long period in which the ship is tossed from side to side, it finally lands on the Himalayan chain. The waters recede, and when the land begins to be visible again, they all come out, and these wise men begin to move to bring civilization back among the survivors, even in very distant areas. This myth, this tradition, this legend is very interesting because it tells us about a flood of a previous civilization, of a new civilization that must be recreated for the Manusmriti, the laws of Manu. These characters were real characters, they were of flesh and bone, who would later be, much later, deified, precisely for this fundamental role of bringing civilization back to men. And the curious thing, however, is that we find this myth in many other areas of the planet, and this obviously raises questions. That is it legitimate for similar, even identical myths to develop in different areas of the planet? But when these myths are mirrored and totally identical, it's natural to raise some questions, and it's natural to look for answers. If we go among the Sumerian people, we find the myth of the 7 Apkallu. The 7 Apkallu are the civilizers of the Sumerian civilization. Tradition says that they arrived on board a luminous egg, as it's described, that, going down into the sea, would then bring out this being, this Apkallu, who is described in the tablets with having an anthropomorphic form, part man and part fish. And these Apkallu practically had the task of teaching the high dignitaries and the rulers of extremely ancient eras of Mesopotamia the rudiments of civilization, so how to irrigate the fields, how to cultivate, how to perform agricultural rotation, how to observe the sky, and even the rudiments of mathematics. In fact, we know from archaeological discoveries of the last 10 years, from tablets that were found, where that which is the basis of all mathematics that would come later was inscribed. And in the Mesopotamian world, Sumerians first and foremost, then obviously also the Akkadians, it is said that there were 7 of these wise men who brought civilization. The incredible thing is that it goes back to very ancient times and epochs. Even with the Sumerians, it reaches 400,000 BC, so an era for us today in which man was not even a sapiens sapiens, but had yet to become so. If we move to Egypt, here too we have the 7 wise men, whose story is told to us in the temple of Edfu, who are the civilizers of the Egyptian world. And also with Egypt, we see how even here the dates compared to our way of counting history are very different. Their Zero dynasty begins around, we don't know precisely, but between 3000 and 3300 BC, with the Scorpion King. But before, other divine and then semi-divine dynasties are spoken of, who were called the Neteru and the Shemsu Hor. So, the Neteru were the gods who ruled over men, and here too there is the Papyrus of Palermo and the Stele of Turin. There are a whole series of archaeological elements that tell us these stories. We are also talking here about extremely more ancient eras, in which, as they say, the divinities, the gods, walked among men, and then there were these beings, these figures, who were usually 7 wise men who brought civilization. In India, all their traditions, at least some historical stories, date back to at least 20 to 30,000 BC. Then, obviously, one is free to say that these are just dates, improbable eras, that they are the ones who have set back in time some of their historical events. Others may believe this. However, if we look at Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, which was buried around 9600 BC, in short, we can calculate that perhaps an advanced civilization may have actually existed 15 or 20,000 years ago. We also find this myth of the 7 wise men in the Chinese world, in the Japanese world, we find it in South America. So, by connecting the dots a little, it seems that the story that emerges is that of 7 figures who, for many peoples, were human, therefore of flesh and bone, but who were extremely advanced and progressed. And then various figures were deified, who almost always arrive after the end of the last glaciation, the event called the Flood, and help to recreate civilization. They restore knowledge, the rudiments of all those elements, those things necessary to start again from scratch. And this is curious, interesting, fascinating, because here too it shows us how Schliemann himself often started from a hypothesis, the story of the fall of Troy. It's not just a myth, but it may have been a historical fact. He started from this working hypothesis, which failed at first. Then he actually found on the Hisarlik hill the ancient city of Troy, as told of in the Homeric poems. The same is happening in the Indian world, both for their knowledge and for the civilizations that precede ours. Here too there is archaeological evidence, both for their traditions, which contain technological scientific knowledge, and data and information which would have been impossible to have in such ancient times, and which, at least in my opinion, necessarily presuppose that someone more advanced and progressed, and perhaps not necessarily of this planet, provided some of their wisest and most knowledgeable men. The concept of good and evil is a relative concept. The Devas today in Hinduism are divided between Devas and Asuras. The Devas are the good beings basically, and the Asuras are the bad ones, the demons. A very fascinating thing is if you look at Zoroastrianism in Afghanistan and Iran, the Asura are the good deities and the Devas are the bad ones. So it's like telling us there were 2 opposing factions of the same reality. But the point is that Devas and Asuras are both the same thing. The Asuras are Devas. They are deities who have more material purposes. They like food, they like wealth, they like women or men. They have more earthly interests. The Devas, as such, in the Indian world, are more evolved beings. They have abandoned or diminished materiality and dedicated themselves to higher things. The concept of good and evil is a relativistic concept, because in Hinduism, as in many religions, it is clearly said that it is right and it is fundamental that there is evil, because I cannot understand and I cannot appreciate what good means if I don't know what its exact opposite is. So it's a bit like yin and yang. I can only understand one thing if I understand and know its exact opposite. Obviously, wars and so on are human abomination and are extremes. However, it's a concept that is as simple as it is fundamental. And then there is a very interesting thing here that we also find in many other myths, that the Indian deities are not immortal, they can die. Krishna, at the end of the Mahabharata, dies because he is hit by an arrow on his heel, and the Yuga ends, the previous Indian era, and the Kali Yuga begins, which is the era according to the current Indian calendar. His death occurred in 3102 BC, therefore more than 5,000 years ago according to Indian texts, and the Kali Yuga will last 432,000 years, so apocalypses like 2012 in the Indian world are definitely a long way off. However, every Indian deity can die. They are beings who are always described as of flesh and blood, who can be killed. The Asuras or Devas can be killed. Simply, they have an extremely longer life than according to our schemes and our way of measuring time. And this was also thanks to the use of certain substances, which are Amrita or Soma, which are the divine drinks that we also find in many other cultures that allow the prolonging of life for a very long time period. And a curious thing that is also linked a little to the Greek myths is that, for example, according to the Indian texts, one could distinguish a deva, a divinity, one of these beings, when he was among men, because they almost always did not walk touching the ground, but they walked, according to the Indian traditions, a few centimeters from the ground, and their body did not cast a shadow. And this is another fact that we find in many traditions, in many civilizations, in many religious schools of thought that were born subsequently. But here too there is such curious particular data, even anomalous in its simplicity, that it can leave us thinking that perhaps there is something true behind their story and history. If I think that on the Earth, the planet Earth, 10, 20,000 years ago, there were, this is a totally personal opinion based on years of research, but there were various realities that perhaps had divided the planet. Perhaps everyone had their own sphere of influence, I don't know. But the myths are so different that they tell us that probably in one area, India and the East for example, there was a certain type of subjects. In other areas such as Sumer, such as Egypt, there were other figures. In South America, still others. It is also dangerous for me to talk about a mother religion or a mother civilization. Personally, whether there have been or not, I think that there have, other civilizations before ours. I'm not thinking of Atlantis or Lemuria. I think there were various realities that were probably, or perhaps not, in contact with each other. They probably fought against each other. We can't know this. But a monolithic entity over the entire planet, well, that no. My opinion on where this knowledge can take us is by reacquiring something that is not ours, because we are talking about the East. Therefore, we are talking about realities and civilizations that are very distant from ours. However, I think that by carrying out the research seriously and correctly, we could actually discover a truly important piece of the history of our planet, which could perhaps help us understand part of our origins, and could also be helpful, today more than ever, to improve ourselves as people. Because, as in the West, in the East the Mahabharata, the Ramayana and many other poems tell us about wars, but the epic poems, also such as the Mahabharata, they have the Gospel of the East, the Bhagavad Gita. That is, they teach us how wrong a certain type of attitude is, how a certain type of life path, that our civilization, always in a hurry, always looking for money for the progress of technology, is losing many pieces. And the Bhagavad Gita, which was not initially part of the Mahabharata, it was inserted more or less in the 3rd century BC, is indeed a breaking point, because it gives a whole series of religious and spiritual teachings which are fundamental for Arjuna, but fundamental for anyone who, over the centuries and the millennia, has read the book. Where are we headed? Where will all this take us? Well, personally, I think that by returning to a genuine East, not the one that is sold to us today in the West, with gurus who gather thousands of people in sports stadiums, but by simply recovering, also by reading the Indian sacred texts, therefore by spending a few euros to buy their most ancient texts, which can be found in many languages, reacquiring that vision, that conception, that life path can be of help. It's obvious that there will be those who will want to embrace it totally and will want to throw themselves headlong into that type of vision. We live in a Western world. We are surrounded by many things that are not Eastern, that hold us back, even towards an approach of this type, for which I think is the right balance between that knowledge, which is in many ways also similar to many philosophies closest to us. However, perhaps for me they have an edge in certain aspects that lead us to probe even more deeply into what we are or what we would like to be. Therefore, rediscovering India, the East in general, with a perspective free from fanaticism and factionalism can allow us to become and be better people, better spirits in today's world, and then, if karma exists, obviously for those who believe in it, to reincarnate, and therefore bring, as they tell us, our cycle of lives towards the end, towards moksha, therefore towards the return to the original source, Anna. Another situation, let's call it curious, that we find in India, especially in the south of India, and which is always connected with the epic poem of the Ramayana, is that they place not to the north, to Mohenjo-daro in present-day Pakistan, the Lanka described by the epic poem itself, but in Sri Lanka. This is little known in the West, but if you look, even with simple tools that can be found online, at the tip of India, you will see that there are a whole series of islets that would seem to connect the southern tip of India with the northern tip of Sri Lanka. Today they are islets, but we know that in ancient times, we are talking about centuries, if not at least 1,000 years ago, this was instead a land that for about 37 kilometers connected the south of India with the north of Sri Lanka. It seems to be a natural formation, but several times they have tried to understand it and to study it. It has never been certified that it could be a natural deposit of sand and rocks, nor that it could be an artificial construction, therefore created by man. But there is a tradition, a legend, precisely in the Ramayana, that sees this isthmus of land, called the Bridge of Adam, as being built by the Vanara, which was the army of the monkey men, commanded by the god Hanuman, with ape-like features, who helped the god Rama to save his wife Sita, who had been kidnapped and subjugated by the demon Ravana. The tradition of the Ramayana tells precisely how this army of Vanara, which literally means men of the forests, for which the transliteration into monkey men is perhaps a more recent, let's say, iconographic adaptation, because in reality the text tells us how these men, yes, they were covered with hair and lived in the forests, but it does not really describe them as monkeys. But this very large group, made up of a few thousand individuals, would have started to take rocks, would have built in a precise way, so putting rocks, wooden logs, sand and stones of various types in order to create a walkway that would connect the south of India with the north of Sri Lanka. And according to the epic poem, they would have succeeded. What we see today is actually an anomaly, something that should not be there. Also because that piece of sea is full of very strong currents, so it is difficult that a deposit could have been created in that area if it had not been done in a precise and conscious way by some individuals. There are old maps, there are ancient traditions that go beyond the epic poem of the Ramayana that tell us just how this isthmus of land connected the two parts. And the curious thing is that the measurements that are given inside the Ramayana actually correspond to what the real length of this stretch of land is, that was once walkable. The tradition claims, in fact, Lanka, the city of Lanka, which was the domain ruled by the demon Ravana, who had kidnapped Rama's wife. It's a bit of a play on names and words, but it places the city of Lanka in present-day Sri Lanka. And even though its territory, plants and so on do not correspond to what is really there today, as centuries or 4,000 years ago in Sri Lanka, however, popular tradition places many places described in this epic poem there. It must be said, however, that there are one or two extremely curious facts. First, there is a structure engraved in a rock that today is a Buddhist temple that is called the Stargate of Sri Lanka, that would seem, and we must use the conditional, to be a very simple representation of what our galaxy is. We do not know who made it or when it was made, but the arrangement of certain incisions recalls and mirrors that of certain constellations, but in particular the position of certain spirals drawn in this vertical rock mirror what the position is of certain galaxies in our galaxy, in the part that we can see. This can obviously be a random event, or it may have been deliberate. However, the question is, who had the tools and knowledge to draw this type of map in very ancient times, more precisely in Sri Lanka? Another very curious thing is a cave, a very ancient cave, and rediscovered in very recent times. We are talking about the end of the 90s, and towards the entrance of this cave, in the higher part, there is an emblematic inscription that states how that cave was the last burial place of a pilot of a Vimana who had flown in the skies some time before. And this brings us back to recall those aircraft, those flying machines, which, to all intents and purposes, flew in those skies at least 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, if not earlier, as is told by the tradition and perhaps even the history of India as well as Sri Lanka. These are obviously scattered elements, but they tell us a very different story compared to the one we have lived and known in the West. Another element of interest that makes us further understand how much the Indian people were aware of things that they should not have known about regards the Sarasvati River. The Sarasvati River is, in the Indian tradition, a legendary river, of which, until a few decades ago, we knew absolutely nothing about, and that is mentioned many times, at least 100 times, in the most sacred text of Hinduism, which is the Rig Veda. It is also a deity, because obviously a river, like other natural phenomena, are also deified within Indian culture. But this immense river, with a bed that seemed to be a few kilometers wide, with an imaginable flow of water, is described over and over again within the Rig Veda, first of all in the most sacred text of Hinduism, and then in other texts. Then what happened? Until around 1998-1999, all this was a beautiful legend that mostly in India was told to children. Then what happens is that satellites are used, the Landsat satellites, which were the first satellites used to study and map the globe at the end of the 90s. We then realise that the area in which it was said in ancient times this immense river was, precisely the river Sarasvati, from the satellites and then from analyses that were performed later, even going to the location, actually it was a very ancient riverbed of a really huge river that had dried up due to a series of tectonic movements. So the water, instead of flowing on the surface, at a certain point had been channeled underground. This river had dried up definitively towards 1900-2000 BC, so we are talking about 4,000 years ago. Historically, that is the period in which the Valinda civilization ends, but it's impossible that this knowledge had reached as far as 1500-1300 BC, when the Rig Veda begins, as far as we know, when the Rig Veda begins to be composed and structured for the first time. Unless there was a link between the Valinda civilization, their knowledge, their culture and tradition, and what in various centuries later will become the first form of Hinduism. And this justifies their culture, their tradition, which tells us how the most sacred knowledge is handed down from mouth to ear, from teacher to disciple, in an unaltered way, therefore without modifying it over the centuries. This could find further justification in the rediscovery of the river Sarasvati, which until 1998-1999 was a legend. Then, after these discoveries made by these satellites, by the Landsat, it returned to being a reality. In my opinion, this makes us understand how little we know about the West. We know little about our planet, but we know even less about everything that is India or the Far East in general. These are cultural heritages that are very distant from us, but not necessarily different, but distant temporally, historically, and which provide us with a history that for us sometimes can seem absurd or impossible. But I believe it to be very genuine, because there is much more evidence in the East, in the Far East, of civilizations prior to ours, of constructions that are impossible to explain with the knowledge of those eras, but they are present and must be investigated. So, well, let's say that my passion started when I was very young, as happens to many. It was an interest even in the family. So, intrigued by what often my parents saw or read, it started, and then mainly during adolescence I started to ask myself questions, as every teenager does. I was passionate about life in the cosmos. I don't like to use the terms UFOs or aliens or extraterrestrials because they are correct, but have been used and, at least in my opinion, abused too much in recent decades and have lost their true original meaning. So I try to use synonyms that make it the same meaning without using those specific terms. And above all, India, the East in general, have always fascinated us Westerners for 1,000 reasons. The sounds, the smells, the scents, totally different traditions from ours, so a world totally to be discovered for a boy, an adolescent. And since at the same time I was also interested in modern mysteries and historical mysteries, therefore from antiquity, I began to ask myself a series of questions, to look for answers, to try to understand why there were so many strange things also in the East. I didn't always find answers to my questions, so like any boy who obviously dedicates a part of his time not only having fun with friends, but since it was something that in my house, in my family, was done anyway, I started to read, to document myself, to start buying the first books that, in short, were circulating at that time, and then to go deeper into the subject. But I rarely found answers for the East, for India. Very often I found copied and pasted phrases that were carried forward from book to book, but there was never anything new. So, as soon as I was, let's say, grown up, I was able to start to move on my own, even to travel alone. So I started to travel. Obviously, one of the first destinations was also India, and then to try to see with my own eyes, not so much the evidence, but what I had read in books, and from there, of course, what was a fascination, a love for a distant land, exploded into something even greater. Because if India fascinates, the East fascinates, when you find yourself there, it terrifies you, it scares you because of the difference compared to the West. But it's a bit like longing for Africa. It totally captures you to the depths of your soul and makes you go back again and again every chance you have. So I have combined my love for the East, for India, for travelling and for archaeology to what is the search for answers to questions that from time to time I ask myself, or about things that I had read. So it's a path that began many years ago, and I don't think it will ever end. Then what I found, discovered and written, maybe it will be useful, maybe it will be disproved, or it will be modified over time. However, it's a path I have tried to share with people who had the same interests, the same fascination for the East, and it is also a path on a personal level of personal growth, not so much not only spiritual, but of discovery and the sharing of a different that we are not used to living and seeing, especially in the West. But then a problem that India has, and I start from the negative side, is that in the big cities they are trying more and more to copy the West. So a big problem from my point of view is that they are losing many traditions, many notions and knowledge that belong to the Indian past, from simple things even to the most complex ones. Certainly the Indians, I don't know how to give an explanation, have an extra gear on certain things. Just look at the greatest computer scientists of the last 50 to 60 years. They are often Indians. There are also mathematicians. There have been brilliant figures like Ramanujan who have yet to be fully understood. There are certainly also a billion and a half of them. They have surpassed the Chinese. They are certainly statistically much more likely to pull out a genius of their own than us, who are less, but they seem to have an extra gear. They seem to have a mental structure that leads them to investigate in a different way, maybe than the way we do, things that are of one field rather than another, and to look not so much for classic solutions, but alternative solutions. Those who know India know this and see it by living it. It's a difficult question to answer because the answer can be misinterpreted and be ambiguous, but they are not more evolved. No, maybe they are more ancient, so they have had more time to develop a certain type of thing. Of course, the various dominations that India has suffered have slowed down this process enormously, as some religions have slowed down the Western process, especially in the Middle Ages. But it is re-emerging in the last century and a half. India is exploding again, not only in terms of the number of people, but above all in terms of the number of brilliant subjects. So it's more about having had more time available, in my opinion.